Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Armacanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 3 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 28th Other Minds Festival, which will take place September 25th to 28th, 2024 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Today I am pleased to be joined by OM28 composer Trimpin. Trimpin is a sound sculptor, composer, engineer, and inventor. A specialist in interfacing computers with traditional instruments, he has developed ways of playing instruments ranging from giant marimbas to stacks of electric guitars via computer. Born in Germany, he relocated to the United States in 1979 and lives today in Washington State. The first two nights of this year's Other Minds Festival feature the world premiere of a newly commissioned work by Trimpin, the Cello Quartet. It features autonomous cellos, circus artists, percussive lampshades, and many more treats for the eyes and ears. I spoke with Trimpin about the work in progress in early August, just before a series of rehearsals in advance of the premiere performances. To start off, can you talk about when you started working on the Cello Quartet? Because I understand this has been quite a long time in the making.
Right. Actually, it started, I got a phone call from the former cellist from the Cello Quartet, Jeff Ziegler. And his wife somehow was running the Sawdust organization in Brooklyn, New York. And Jeff asked me, they want to commission me to do a piece for cello, somehow a cello interaction with him. And it will be sponsored by National Sawdust. But this was before the pandemic. And suddenly the pandemic was there, and I got the phone call and say, look, we cannot, get the funding together right now. National Sawdust is closed, right now because of pandemic. So nothing will happen at this moment. But at the same time, I kept going, investigating the idea of using somehow the cello as not particular as a cello musical instrument, but more as a body, as an instrument. And also the name National Sawdust triggered somehow this idea that the cello or one of the cellos should create sawdust by using actually a carpenter saw instead of a bow. Instead of bowing the cello, actually the carpenter saw is cutting into the cello in a rhythmic kind of temporal structure. So, of course, I just went on, exploring different ways to interact with the cello that the other cellists actually could use their cello, their own instrument, to interact with the autonomous cellos. So I just kept going without even knowing there's no funding. There's, just the idea just kept on going until a few years ago when I was reading about the Hewlett Foundation grant for their 50th anniversary, giving grant money away for a special project which had to include different disciplines like music composition, dance, movements, and technology like robotics and kind of artificial intelligence. So there was numerous disciplines had to be covered in this grant. So I applied for it and I was one of the finalists. But the Hewlett Foundation doesn't give any money to an individual artist, only to a nonprofit organization. So that's when I contacted Other Minds. I called up Charles Armacanian and asked, you guys want to be a part of this? And of course, immediately, yes, we are. And that's how everything started.
And so I see your three autonomous cellos that you built sitting behind you. Can you describe for people who are listening what these look like, how they function?
Well, they're all on wheels, like they have actually a motorized kind of a way to move on stage, so they can move around in any direction on stage. And the idea was also for this project to give music or sound another dimension. Like we know, in music, there's like three dimensions, like pitch, timbre, and time, and adding like a fourth dimension, which would be spatial aspects, like moving sound through space. So this was this idea behind having actually not like a stationary sound source, an instrument, and this instrument's actually moving around stage. As well, the piano, which is also part of it, is also moving on stage. The live cellist, she's also moving on stage. At the same time, the dancers, performers are moving. So everything is in a constant movement. So this was kind of adding this other dimension, like spatial sound. And this was kind of the way I was starting with the concept of having like the autonomous cellos on wheels, and they are all computer controlled, like from a MIDI musical instrument digital interface program. So there's a computer kind of sending all this information, when to play, where to move, how to move. And it's kind of the choreography involved of the autonomous instruments compared to then the dancers and performers who are on stage. So they actually can interact together.
And how do the cellos and the piano know where to move? Have you pre-programmed where they go? Are you doing it live? Are they somehow interacting with the live performers?
Well, that's what we are still working on right now. They are waiting for MIDI commands to know when to move or to rotate around or to go any kind of direction. So actually in 10 days or so, Margaret Fisher, the choreographer, she is coming, and the costume designer, and one of the performers coming here to my studio, where we kind of work out the last kind of details, how the interaction could functioning between the performers and the instruments. Are they controlled by just like a MIDI command, or are the performers are involved? Because there's also my interfaces are both capable of doing human interaction by certain triggering kind of events while they're moving, or just like having it set in a MIDI program kind of sequence.
And I hear the three cellos have names. I see one with some sort of horns coming out of them, another with the saw that you mentioned, and one that's sort of upside down and sliced in half. So what are their names, and where'd those names come from?
Well, the one that's with the horns, that's called George. And it's actually named after George Lewis, the trombone player, which I was always kind of fascinated with his sounds he created. And the middle cello, which has actually the wooden saw and a lot of preparation parts, it's called Charlotte, after Charlotte Mormon. She was an experimental cellist, and I saw her actually a few times live in the early 80s. And then on the right, it's the bass. There are four bass strings on the cellos, and it's called Charlie. It's called after Charlie Hayden, the bassist, which I also knew from the CalArts time. So these are kind of the models, or the way I had to give them a name. It was easier to communicate. Also, I have a lot of sketches, and it was too confusing before I gave them names. So giving them names was much more easier to communicate with them. Also visually, And there are numerous, like these are the version 2.3, like the version 1.0 is way, it still exists somewhere. I still have them, but it evolved, more into a newer version because I had to make changes the way how I was envisioning and thinking what they actually should do. The same is with the piano, which is on the other side. Here, it's fully prepared. It also has a four-setzer, which has 88 mechanical fingers. And inside, above the strings, are the preparation installed, which are all MIDI kind of controlled. And there are also certain kind of devices built in where the strings are getting set into vibration without even touching the strings. And these strings will be activated through magnetic fields. And this magnetic field would actually bring the strings into vibration. And that's actually the first piece in the performance. It's just like the piano creating the sounds. And all the sounds coming from inside the piano will be transposed up 42 times. And then we are actually ending up in the spectrum of light, like the low frequency from a piano, which we can hear because it's in our range of hearing. When you go up 42 times, you're actually in the frequency spectrum of visible light. So all the projection for the first piece the audience will see, all the colors are actually generated from the sound of the piano. So they are not arbitrary, they are not just like colors. And I'm using the first 11 harmonics, starting with a low A. And the piano is actually tuned in 432 hertz, not in the standard concert pitch of 440, it's 432. Other instruments I'm using, they're also tuned into 432. At the same time, there are some drone sounds emitting from some other cellos. And this basically is the source for the creation of the colors.
So the visuals then sort of an extension of the harmonic series, all connected.
Right, right.
And so this is the Cello Quartet. We've talked about 3 of the cellos. Could you also talk about this 4th cello, which will be a live player, Laurie Goldston?
Right. So as the 4th cello is a human actually played cello, which is also sitting on the cello mobile. So while Laurie Goldston plays the live cello, she's also using like the plugged and unplugged version. Like the unplugged would be the pure acoustical cello. But the plugged, she actually is using some kind of pedals where she is using some processing of the sound coming from the cello. So while she is playing live, she is also moving constantly on stage. So there's no kind of stationary spot. Everything is moving. Like in the first part, the grand piano is placed right in front of the audience. And throughout the first piece, which is about 14 minutes long, slowly it moves towards the backstage. So the piano is on wheels, on motorized wheels. And while it's playing, it's also moving. And then it will stay for the other parts.
And could you talk about what the music itself is going to sound like?
Well, the first piece is more, like I just mentioned, based on this kind of long sustained sounds where you create this kind of acoustical environment just generated by the vibration of the strings using a magnetic field. And then the next part will be Laurie Goldston's solo improvisation piece interacting with the dancers. And then the third piece was originally based, or I composed it for a commission for the Seattle Symphony for musicians. But then for this part, I rearranged all the music for the autonomous cellos and the piano and the live musician. So they are kind of interacting among each other while they are on different location on stage, and they kind of respond to each other using also like the idea of, goes a little bit back, being inspired by Henry Brant with his kind of sounds coming from different locations. And he actually asked me once to build a mechanical conducting arm where he could conduct a certain part of the ensemble in one location, and the other arm would conduct the other musician in a totally different location. So they could all be kind of having their own kind of timing structure. So the third piece, it's a little bit based on this kind of conversations going on stage among the three autonomous cellos and the live cello and the piano, kind of a conversation moving constantly in space. And the fourth piece starts actually with some lamp shades being converted into a drum machine. The lampshade actually acts as a drum skin. It will be mechanically kind of activated by a kind of a drumstick. And they also have like RGB light built in. So it starts more as a rhythmic kind of movement. And then somehow it ends up with maybe the last 12, 18 measures, a little bit based on David Bowie's Let's Dance for the last few measures, because it's kind of a little bit, it ends up as disco with all the lampshades flickering, but it's just like it starts when you might recognize that sounds familiar, but that's it, then it stops. So that's kind of the exploration of using these lampshades as a musical instrument at the same time as a light source. So that's what I'm just working on right now, to get all the synchronization going with the light and with the sound of the lamp shades.
So you've mentioned a little bit about the visuals. We have lights, projections, and then these three circus artists who will be choreographed by Margaret Fisher. Can you talk about your collaborations with Margaret so far?
Right. So right at the beginning, when we had the first conversation, Margaret came up with this great idea, not using traditional ballet dancers or traditional kind of dancers, more adding other aspect of performing art, like using the performer as a dancer, as a movement, moving the body, but in a different direction. And I was immediately excited about this idea, using more the body of a performer in terms of what this body can do, not just like a dancer is moving. There's completely different expression what a body can do. And I also was starting designing some kind of not costumes, they are more like a part of the performer equipment to wear, which is also interactive. And it was a little bit inspired by this German Bauhaus artist, Oskar Schlemmer. He wrote 100 years ago a piece called the Triadisches Ballett, and he used like this very futuristic costumes and movements in his pieces. And also 100 years ago, the piece was written for mechanical instruments. And it was performed in 1922, the first time. And in 1926, it was performed again. And Paul Hindemith was composing the music, but it was also for mechanical instruments. There was not one live musician involved, was all mechanical instruments. So it was a little bit the inspiration of Oskar Schlemmer. And I saw the reconstructive piece, the Triadisches Ballett, in 1980, I think. And so still ideas came back like for this piece, using certain kind of different ideas of a costume design, what a dancer or a performer could wear. So they are like these parts which are like fans you are using in a theater to cool your face, but they are kind of opening up in a certain kind of a rhythm. So the dancers, performers are wearing this kind of outfits. And this was a part working out with the choreographer, with Margaret, to come up with ideas where they actually also interact with the instruments as well. And when she is here, we are working on the final kind of ideas, how far this interaction actually could go.
And we should mention the name of the costume designer is Cynthia Duval.
Right. And Cynthia is also coming with Margaret. And I'm also working with Anna Henson. She is doing the projections. So we have to work out in the next few weeks after Margaret and Cynthia and Bree are leaving here, then we can kind of finalize everything. For me, it's probably the most ambitious work I ever did because it's over a longer period of time. I really had the luxury of focusing on developing this piece without a 6 months time frame. Like here, I'm working on at least in the last 2 years. And since then, it was almost like a daily kind of work schedule to work on the piece.
Great. Well, we here are all very much looking forward to seeing the final product. So thanks for talking with me about this.
Thanks, Joey.
You can hear the world premiere of Trimpin's The Cello Quartet at Other Minds Festival 28 on September 25th and 26th at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 28th festival is September 25th to 28th, 2024 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.